Hi everyone, Alexander here for another edition of 30 Days of Symphony at the LSO. Well, I hope you've been having as much fun as I have in exploring these symphonies of Ludwig van Beethoven. 2020, of course, is his 250th anniversary year. Beethoven's symphonies are such a monument in our shared culture. One, of course, can spend one's entire life enjoying and trying to understand these works that are ever complicated and yet so simple and direct in their expression. It's the great voyage of a lifetime to get to know these pieces better and better. Of Beethoven's 9 symphonies, of course, the Mount Everest, the highest peak of all, is his last of the cycle, his Symphony number 9 in D minor, so-called the Choral Symphony. One has to remember that the Ninth Symphony was written after a 10-year hiatus from Symphony number 8. I guess it's easy to assume that, Beethoven would write a symphony, then take a break, then write another one, take another break, and so forth. Actually, he didn't. He wrote the vast bulk of his symphonic output in his early to middle years, and he would often write them in pairs. So we get these play of opposites where we have the struggle of the Symphony number 5 with the serene contemplation of the Symphony number 6, the pastoral, written almost exactly at the same time. Similarly, Symphony number 7, that bacchanalian feast of revelry, along with the more subtle and sophisticated and, in the best sense, backward-looking, traditional Symphony number 8, were also written as think of them as two sides of the same coin. But then, after the premiere of the Symphony number 8, around 1813, 1814, he basically takes a 10-year hiatus. Now Beethoven goes from what is generally referred to as his heroic middle period to the unending mystery of his late style. It's really Beethoven who created, it's one of these great sub-themes in Western culture, this idea of a late style, of an artist who passes into late middle age and artistic maturity and composes or creates at an even higher level than before. And the other great example from the 19th century is, of course, Giuseppe Verdi, the great genius composer of Italian opera, who was writing music well into his early 80s. And again, the music was always great, but he somehow goes deeper and deeper and deeper. Beethoven is doing the same thing in the cycle of his 9 symphonies. Each one of them is a masterpiece, even the very first, written as a symphony that his teacher, Franz Joseph Haydn, would have surely recognized. By the Symphony number 9, begun in 1822 and premiered in 1824, Beethoven is now on a cosmic journey. He has left the late classical style of Haydn and Mozart, of the 18th century, of the Ancien Régime in France. He's left that all behind and now has become one of the great masters of the Romantic style, birthed to us via the Age of Revolution. As I've been saying, you probably think I have this medical condition called France on the brain, but it really has to be remembered that almost all of Beethoven's large-scale, mature works have some relationship with that seismic historical experience of the French Revolution that started in 1789, rocked Europe to its foundations, and really did not end until the Congress of Vienna in 1815, really the beginning of the golden age of diplomatic history that really went all through to the end of the Cold War. This idea that the great diplomats of Europe would get together and try to solve the world's problems. Well, broadly speaking, there were many, many injustices, but they did. Napoleon and his forces were finally defeated. The French monarchy was restored in a more benevolent form. And now Beethoven, here in 1822, could look back at that whole experience, both his own personal experience, now going into late middle age, but also the experience, the tumult of the whole world. Charles de Gaulle, the great French president, immortally observed that life is a struggle, and no one knew that better than Ludwig van Beethoven. So it's that whole wealth of personal experience and universal experience that's brought to bear in this Ninth Symphony that truly heralds the Romantic age. Beethoven's First Symphony takes up almost the exact amount of time that a performance of the first movement of the Ninth Symphony does. Here is a mammoth, colossal work, the kind of early Romantic era symphonic version of a mighty ancient Greek temple with 4 great pillars. Each movement is kind of a symphonic poem in itself. At the very beginning, Beethoven never forgets his traditions. He never forgets the world from whence he came. And the beginning of the Ninth Symphony, on the one hand, sounds so modern, and it's a sound world, this kind of musical morass of D minor that sounds so modern, and yet he really is giving us his updated interpretation of the opening of that great, again, late style, that great late oratorio by his teacher, Joseph Haydn. Of course, I'm referring to the creation, and that opening scene in the creation, the book of Genesis, his representation of chaos. Beethoven takes that idea from Haydn and just ramps it up into what is Richard Wagner, the great opera composer, would have thought really is the beginning of the modern era in music. We have no idea for several measures where this chaotic musical mass, like some gradually awakening monster, is going. But of course, it is the beginning of another grand titanic essay by Beethoven in sonata form. But the mood of the first movement is chaos, tumult, ignorance, tragedy, with moments rather like rays of sunlight shot through an overcast sky, moments of hope. The second movement is the ultimate example of Beethoven's Bacchanalian scherzo. We get that sense of a revelry and abandonment that you felt in the Symphony No. 7, but here it's no laughing matter. Here it is a gravely serious essay in D minor with these incredible orchestral thunderbolts where the timpani, the kettle drums, kind of lead the rest of the orchestra. This truly shocking music. And this is for an audience in Vienna that by this time had gotten used to the violent outbursts of Beethoven's music, but nothing still could have prepared them for this. The third movement, the slow movement, is in another favorite form of Beethoven, the theme and variations. But here we have a double theme and variations, 2 gently contrasting ideas which both get their own series of variations, one after the other. The mood is of utter and complete serenity. Again, it is that Zen-like contemplation that we experienced in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, now on a cosmic plane. Then we have the fourth movement, the finale, the mother of all symphonic finales, really a symphony in itself in several interlinking movements. As Beethoven in his third Leonora overture, which we celebrated last night, really invented for the Romantic age this new form of the symphonic poem, kind of an overture on steroids. Now he gives the world something that 19th century composers would utilize again and again, this new idea of cyclic form in which the beginning of the finale of this symphony is a literal recapitulation of the main ideas of the 3 preceding movements. Some of the great composers of the late Romantic era, like Franz Liszt, excuse me, and César Franck would delight in this new innovation. It's an amazing moment, especially when you consider that no one had really done this ever before. We finally get to the main theme, which is his setting of the great early Romantic German poet, almost his contemporary, but a little older, Friedrich Schiller, his Ode to Joy. This is something that Beethoven had wanted to set for years. Remember, it was Mozart, of all the great composers, Mozart is divine. Mozart just wrote his ideas directly into the orchestral score. It was like he was taking dictation from the Lord himself. Beethoven, you can have some comfort in the fact that Beethoven was like you and me, a man of flesh and blood, as they would say, who just labored for many years, in some cases, over his works, would sketch and revise again and again and again. So Beethoven had had the idea of setting Schiller's Ode to Joy, this hymn to universal brotherhood that, again, in the wake of Napoleon, in the wake of all the injustices of millennia, the world so desperately needed. Beethoven had wanted to set this for years. He had various sketches, and now he finally gets his chance in what I think it can be said Beethoven must have known was his last and final symphony. The baritone exclaims, as Schiller writes, out of the chaos and tumult of the quotations from the three previous movements, he sings in German, "No, friends, not these tones. Let us sing of something more joyful." And then he leads up the fellow singers, the choir, and the orchestra into this immortal tune, Beethoven's setting of the Ode to Joy. In a nod to the music of Mozart, Beethoven has paid tribute to Haydn already, and now he pays tribute to his other musical forefather, the divine Mozart, with a little interlude of a Turkish march, this alla turca style that Mozart delighted in. It was a great fad of the late 18th and 19th century.